Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. London seemed to be wearing the same dreary greys of habit while simultaneously simmering with heat on one of those odd summer days. Although July had arrived, the air was heavy with soot and the distant rumble of impending thunder instead of sunlight. The curtains were drawn against the glare at Baker Street, and Holmes, without pipe or dressing gown, strode restlessly between the fireplace and the settee, eyes distracted and fingers steepled. I had hardly taken 2 sips of my tea when Mrs. Hudson knocked urgently and came in without waiting for a response, followed by a clatter on the stairs. Only the most unusual kind of guest could arouse the weird mixture of annoyance and curiosity on her face. Mr. Holmes, a gentleman. He is, well, I'll let you make your own judgment. She retreated after making that cryptic comment, and a moment later, a man entered our sitting room. He was thin, maybe a few years younger than I was, with pale, agitated eyes and a collar that was obviously not valet-attended in days. His shoes were covered in a thin, crumbling layer of reddish dust, the kind one might connect with arid rural roads in the middle of summer, even though he was standing on a nice Persian rug. A drop of sweat stuck to his forehead, and his frock coat hung crookedly off his small shoulders. Holmes immediately turned away from the fireplace and gave the man that hawk-like look that has caused many a seasoned criminal to make a shaky confession. Before the man could even open his mouth, he exclaimed, "You have come directly from Northamptonshire." The unfamiliar person blinked. "Ah, yes, that is accurate. You arrived in London just before noon this morning after changing at Market Harborough, after taking the 6:10 train from Kettering. You mustered the nerve to knock after hesitating at our door for at least 15 minutes. The man relaxed his jaw. "Pardon me," Holmes responded, bowing slightly. "It is merely observation, not magic. Naturally, the dust from rural clay roads in July has a distinct color and texture, just like your shoes. The mark of a stone platform edge, characteristic of the Market Harborough station, can be seen on the right heel. The reluctance, well, Mrs. Hudson's frustration was as revealing as a chain of watches. A small, rattled smile came to the man's lips. "George Ellicott is my name. I think a horrible thing has occurred, and I'm at a loss for whom else to turn." "Mr. Ellicott, you made a good decision," I remarked, motioning for him to take a seat. "What kind of trouble are you having?" He sat slowly, as though the very act of unburdening had cost him dearly. "It's Dr. Ambrose Northcote, my uncle. He has vanished, disappeared 3 days ago. We initially assumed he had just left for one of his lectures because, you see, he is a historian who is fascinated with historic churches and English manuscripts. If he discovers a Saxon reference or a destroyed abbey that is worth his time, he will vanish for days." Holmes gave a nod. "A man of focused enthusiasms. And yet you are troubled by this absence." Ellicott sat up straight, because the Curzon manuscript would always be with him. "Never. The rarest item he owns is a 9th-century palimpsest that he discovered while visiting a Belgian convent. He kept it with him at all times. When he went missing, it was left in his study, open as if he had only just set it down. It's hard to say, but there was a fragrance in the room, and the lamps were still glowing." "Smell?" Holmes asked sharply. Ellicott paused. "Similar, like burnt almonds." "Very, very faint." My aunt brushed it off. Claimed that something had probably been dumped in the grate by the maid. "However, Holmes whispered almost to himself, "Prussic acid." I stood up straight. "You must not mean—" "I just mean that a living man's study shouldn't have that kind of odor," Holmes remarked. "Mr. Ellicott, keep going." 2 days after that, I went back to the house. My aunt insisted that the police be called by that point. However, they couldn't find anything. No body, no indications of struggle, no forceful entry. Just my uncle's shoes by the entrance and the abandoned study. Holmes, who had been perched on the settee's arm, suddenly rose to his feet. Shoes? Indeed. His old sneakers, his walking shoes, muddy. He vanished in the morning, and his boots? Remaining in the cabinet. Unless he was going somewhere in the country, he never wore them. He intended to visit a church in Ashton Leigh, the village he had specifically mentioned. However, There is no documentation that he ever showed up. With wide eyes, Holmes turned to face me. Watson, this puzzle seems like it would be very interesting. This afternoon we are traveling to Northamptonshire. Are you coming? Half incredulous, Ellicott inquired. I'll be there, Holmes declared. And I shall eat your uncle's dusty shoes with mustard and salt, if Dr. Northcote has not been killed, kidnapped or coerced into some voluntary disappearance by forces as yet unseen. Holmes had already turned away, pacing now with new vitality. But Ellicott laughed nervously. There is deception here, Watson. Dusty shoes in July, a palimpsest left open, and the ghost of bitter almonds. Mark my words, a mind has orchestrated this disappearance with precision. But every mind leaves a trail. We departed that same afternoon, with Ellicott in tow, and Holmes humming some forgotten Gregorian chant beneath his breath, as the train whisked us northward into a landscape thick with secrets, one of which somewhere in Ashton lay, or its shadow was waiting to be uncovered. The compartment of the northbound train rattled steadily as the English countryside passed in blurred tapestries of green and ochre beyond the rain-marked windows. Though Holmes often remained silent during such journeys, buried in thought or the folds of some obscure monograph, this time he sat upright, his gaze fixed on the smudged glass, as though watching not trees and fields but patterns invisible to any eyes but his. George Ellicott, our unexpected companion, sat opposite, nervously folding and unfolding a handkerchief on his lap. I had attempted, with little success, to coax him into conversation regarding his uncle's temperament and habits. Holmes, who had not spoken since we left the station, suddenly turned his head and spoke in a clear, unhurried voice. You have not told us, Mr. Ellicott, what your uncle was doing with the Curzon manuscript at the time of his disappearance. The young man blinked, caught off guard. I'm not entirely sure. He kept it in his study, as I said. He was preparing a paper, I think, for the Royal Society of Antiquaries, something about marginalia, layers of overwritten text in old religious documents. He was very excited, claimed he had discovered a previously unknown reference to King Offa of Mercia. Offa? Holmes muttered. Curious. An Anglo-Saxon king known for borders and boundaries. Tell me, was he expecting any visitors in the days leading to his vanishing? Only the postman, as far as I know. But I did find one thing odd. My aunt told me that the bell had rung late the evening before he disappeared. She assumed it was an accident or a child's prank. But the maid swore it was rung twice, a full minute apart. Uncle had answered it himself, she said, but when she asked the next morning, he brushed it off and said it had been no one. Holmes made a small noise in his throat, halfway between curiosity and irritation. And no one thought to follow that up? The housekeeper asked the postman. He'd delivered nothing that evening. There's no other regular caller. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. Twice, once to announce and once to confirm. It was not a prank. Someone came to Dr. Northcote with purpose, someone he either recognized or had been expecting. I glanced between them. It sounds like the sort of meeting one does not discuss. A secret rendezvous, perhaps a scholar's disagreement turned personal. Possibly, Holmes said, his voice detached, but unlikely. Academics are not known to duel by gaslight. No, Watson, there is something else here. The dust on Mr. Ellicott's shoes? My shoes. Ellicott looked down in surprise. You have tracked the very same red chalk into our compartment that your uncle left on his walking shoes. It is not the dust of a railway platform or a London street, and yet neither of you has been in the countryside this morning. Where then does it come from? Ellicott flushed. I hadn't thought. I passed through the garden path at the side of the house. There's an old root cellar that's seldom used. Uncle Ambrose kept his fossil samples in it. It's never locked. I suppose I wandered through that way when the front door was being cleaned. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Indeed, I shall wish to examine that path. The cellar as well. Ellicott's fingers tightened on his handkerchief. You think something happened there? I think, Holmes said, that your uncle may have left through that garden path rather than by any main entrance. And if he did not do so voluntarily, then someone guided him or dragged him that way. We arrived at Kettering by mid-afternoon. From there we took a hired trap through the gently rolling hills of Northamptonshire, past summer fields and churches ancient as any abbey in France. Ashton lay revealed itself at the end of a winding lane, little more than a clustering of stone houses wrapped round a sunken green. its church spire poking like a weathered tooth above a copse of elm. Dr. Northcote's house sat a few furlongs beyond the village proper, bracketed by trees and half swallowed by ivy. As we dismounted, Holmes strode ahead of us up the gravel path with purposeful steps, pausing not at the door but veering sharply to the left. "Watson, with me. Mr. Ellicott, fetch the key to the root cellar." We followed Holmes around to the side of the house, where a narrow trail cut through overgrown yew bushes toward a half-sunken door of iron-strapped wood. The ground here bore a dry coating of red dust and flattened tufts of clover. Holmes bent low, eyes scanning, fingers brushing the surface with gentle taps. "This soil is not typical of the rest of the garden," he murmured. "Note the cracked patterning here, fragments of something crushed underfoot. Bones? No, seeds. A spill from a linen bag, perhaps. And here, look, Watson." I crouched beside him and saw the faintest impression in the clay. A scuff, the edge of a heel, and what appeared to be the ball of a toe angled sharply inward. "A man walking," I said. "Or running?" "No," Holmes replied. "Stumbling. Look again, his gait is uneven. These marks are deeper on the left side. That suggests either injury or assistance." Ellicott returned with the key, and Holmes took it without a word, unlocking the door and swinging it open with a groan of rusted hinges. A breath of damp air met us, earthy, tinged with mold. We descended a short flight of stone steps into a narrow, vaulted chamber where shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes and glass jars clouded with dust. Holmes moved silently, examining corners with his lantern until he came to a stack of crates pushed awkwardly aside. There, behind them lay a single glove, fine leather, the sort a gentleman might wear to shield his hands from dust while handling rare materials. Holmes picked it up delicately and turned it inside out. In the seam, nearly invisible, was a thin line of crimson. "Blood," he said. Ellicott recoiled. But that glove is his. "I'm sure of it." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood, eyes gleaming with that peculiar cold light which signaled to me that his mind was beginning to lock into alignment. "We need to talk to your aunt," he finally stated. "I would like to see the study in its original state." "Obviously," Ellicott muttered. In this manner, we returned to the house and entered the study of the late Dr. Northcote after passing through a little hallway. The room was just as he had described. A mahogany desk with the Curzon manuscript open, its delicate vellum hardly stirred by the breeze that crept through the partially closed window. 2 wall lamps with dried wicks, and a well-worn armchair in front of a frigid grate. Holmes didn't touch the manuscript at all. Rather, he leaned down and sniffed at the grate. Then he stood up suddenly. He stated, "There is no scent at this time, but there is a thumbprint in soot on the brass poker. I assume not from your aunt's hand." Ellicott gave a headshake. "She wouldn't have made contact with anything." Holmes approached the desk gently, while examining a corner of the blotter next to the document rather than the manuscript itself. There was a ripped piece of paper, nearly concealed under an inkstand. Using tweezers, Holmes extracted it and held it up to the light. Despite being no bigger than a postage stamp, the fragment included the solitary word hurriedly written, "Petrol." We looked at each other. Watson and me. Holmes moved away from the desk and put the scrap in his case. "There is an urgency here, Watson," he stated gently. "The kind I don't like. We might be a day too late already, but it is not yet hopeless. Come on, before it gets dark, we have one more stop. To where?" Holmes's gaze was far away. "To Ashton Leigh's churchyard. If my instincts are correct, I will then look for a man whose shoes are too clean for July." The sun was low in the sky by the time we passed the churchyard boundary. Its feeble July light filtered through the thick branches of ancient yews and decaying gravestones, bending as though in mid-conversation. A gentle breeze rustled the parched grass, murmuring through moss-covered names and dates that had long since given themselves up to the passage of time. I could feel the weight in every step, an almost imperceptible tension humming beneath his coat and collar, as though his thoughts were pressing far ahead of his body. Even as Holmes moved with his customary economy of motion, Ellicott trailed behind him, silent but vigilant. I stayed by Holmes's side, watching him look at the ground between the graves rather than the graves themselves, the trails, the loose stones, the small slants in the grass that might signify much more to him than to me. After a while, Holmes said, "There," stopping suddenly next to the north wall. "The crushed wild sorrel is visible. It is unique to this area of the yard. It rarely recovers from trampling and grows poorly in shadow. Recently someone was here. Several times I followed his eyes. Upon closer examination, I noticed a minor dip that led toward the back of the church, where the masonry met an older structure, a small chapel or apse that had been abandoned for a long time. At first glance, the patch appeared to be just another dirty border of earth. Holmes knelt down and brushed the flattened grass with a gloved hand. For 3 days, 4 perhaps, and see this. Fine particles of red clay embedded in the stems, the same stuff found near the root cellar. The identical road was taken by the man who walked here. However, he went from the churchyard to the house, so the directions are inverted. Still hanging behind us, Ellicott took a step toward us. That would mean he entered through the garden. At night, probably, and without causing any commotion within the house. Anyone who passed through here had either scouted the grounds in advance or was quite familiar with them. I looked across at the ancient apse. Its tiny door, twisted with age and lichen-stained, was partially open. "Do you believe he entered from within?" Holmes replied. "I do." In addition, I believe he concealed something there prior to the disappearance. He got up and walked quickly over to the door, carefully pushing it open. With a gentle protest from the hinges, we entered a small silent room that was heavy with dust. The smell of parchment and dry stone filled the room, reminiscent of Dr. Northcote's study. Despite being stale and unused, the air had a hint of recent occupation. Only a raised stone slab in the middle and a wooden chest partially hidden under a canvas sheet in one corner were the only furnishings. Holmes immediately went to the chest and knelt next to it. Without turning, he said, "Watson, I need your help." We lifted the lid together. A lantern, a bundle of rope, a few iron nails, a small trowel, and at the bottom, a velvet pouch that was tightly knotted were among the jumbled items that were inside. After removing the pouch, Holmes opened it. Within lay a ring, gold, heavy, and oddly warm to the touch. It bore a sigil I did not recognize, an angular design that seemed at once ecclesiastical and alien. Holmes studied it for only a moment before slipping it into his pocket. "It confirms it," he said quietly. There was preparation involved. The man who came to Dr. Northcote's study did not do so on impulse. He had tools, secrecy, and a plan. But what troubles me most is that ring. Why? Because I have seen its like before, once in Vienna. Worn by a man who called himself a priest, but trafficked in forgeries. Church relics, falsified charters, bones marked as saints. A ring such as this would be his seal, his calling card, Petralchus. I stared at him. "The name on the paper scrap?" "Yes," Holmes said. "And I fear he's far more dangerous than any charlatan. He is clever, persistent, and without a shred of conscience." Ellicott stepped forward. "You mean to say my uncle knew this man?" "I believe he did. Or rather, I believe Petralchus knew him. A scholar of antiquities, especially rare manuscripts, would be of great interest to such a man. But if Dr. Northcote discovered that he had been used to validate a forgery or enable a theft, he would never stay silent." We left the apse and retraced our steps through the churchyard. As we passed the rector's house, Holmes paused suddenly and tilted his head. "Do you hear that?" I stopped. "Only the wind." "No, beyond it. A ticking. Faint." We followed the sound to the rear window of the church. Holmes peered inside, then motioned sharply. The vestry was dim but not deserted. A man sat hunched over a ledger near the far table, his fingers twitching nervously against the wood. The ticking was coming from a pocket watch he had laid beside his papers. A tall man, perhaps in his late 50s, with a pointed beard and sallow skin. He had not noticed us. Holmes rapped smartly on the glass. The man startled, then quickly rose and came around to the door. When he opened it, his eyes passed over Ellicott and me before settling uneasily on Holmes. "May I help you?" he asked in a soft, reedy voice. Holmes gave a slight bow. "Forgive the intrusion. I am Mr. Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are investigating the disappearance of Dr. Ambrose Northcote. And you, sir, are—" The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Holmes to catch it. "Mr. Lemuel Hartley," he said. "I am the church steward. I assist with parish records," Holmes gave a nod. "Of course." "Then perhaps you can tell us, has anyone used the apse recently? Or been seen entering through the rear gate after dark?" Hartley paled slightly. "No. That part of the church has been disused for decades. I would have noticed any activity. Holmes tilted his head. Indeed, even though you do not reside on the grounds. The steward fumbled. I live just across the green. I come in early most mornings. Holmes smiled without warmth. Mr. Hartley, do you recognize this? He held out the ring, now carefully wrapped in a handkerchief. The steward recoiled at once, eyes wide, hands clenched. No, he said too quickly. I've never seen it before. Yet it bears the mark of a false order, Holmes said quietly. Hand is tied to a man who may well have entered your church, uninvited and left behind more than secrets. If you have aided this man, knowingly or not, it is time to speak. Hartley looked as if he might flee, but then his shoulders sagged. I didn't know his name, he whispered. Only that he came asking about old burial lists, wanted to verify something about a knight named Malton, buried under the apse. He offered money, said he was writing a history of obscure monastic rites. Did he bring anything with him? A case, narrow, locked. He told me it contained relics. I let him stay in the apse for 3 nights. I never asked questions, Holmes turned. Watson, that case may still be there. If it is, I dare say it does not contain relics. But something altogether more troubling. Mr. Hartley, you must tell us everything you can about this man's appearance, speech and movements. Hartley nodded slowly. He said he'd return this week, on the 4th day since he left. That's tomorrow. Holmes's face hardened. Then we must prepare to receive him, the man said, but not as guests. This man believes he is walking in shadows. Let's see how he fares in the light. The sun had long since set behind Ashton Leigh's church spire, leaving long, uncertain shadows that crept over the stones like whispered secrets. The warm July air had turned cool with the arrival of night, and a pale half-moon cast a silvery haze over the churchyard. Holmes and I stood just inside the apse's stone arch, concealed by the warped door. George Ellicott was sent back to the house with strict instructions to remain alert but unobtrusive. Mr. Hartley, intimidated by Holmes' firm but tactful demeanor, agreed to remain in the rectory and pretend ignorance if the mysterious visitor approached him again. Holmes had instilled in him the value of precision and silence. We had concealed ourselves amid the broken pews and disused altars of the apse, a lantern dimmed and hooded between us. Holmes crouched in stillness, his lean figure like that of a resting hawk poised to strike. I had become familiar over the years with the electric tension that gripped him in such moments, when observation became its own form of pursuit, and the mind, like a spring wound tight, waited for the final turn of the key. The hours passed slowly. Distant owls called from the trees, and once or twice the wind stirred the grass with a hiss that sent a shiver down my spine. Holmes didn't move. His eyes, faintly visible in the lamplight, never wavered from the slim opening that looked out onto the side path leading toward the garden. Then, just past midnight, a sound reached us, quiet yet distinct. A footfall. Holmes raised one hand in a small motion. I held my breath. Another step followed. Then 2 more. A figure emerged from the trees beyond the wall. Cloaked, hat pulled low. He paused, surveying the churchyard with the wary air of someone well versed in caution. The moon caught the edge of his cheek as he moved forward, a narrow face pinched at the temples with a dark, neatly trimmed beard. He carried a satchel over one shoulder and something longer beneath his coat, too rigid for a walking stick. Holmes exhaled silently beside me. His fingers twitched once, then stilled. The man crossed the churchyard swiftly, treading the same crushed patch of sorrel Holmes had examined earlier that afternoon. He reached the apse door and hesitated only a moment before opening it. He stepped inside. I felt Holmes shift, rising with soundless grace. Before the intruder could properly register the shadow before him, Holmes had struck a match and lit the lantern, illuminating the chamber in a pale golden glow. The stranger stopped mid-step. His eyes, sharp, intelligent, but unmistakably alarmed, locked with Holmes. He did not speak, but I saw one hand slowly drifting to the inside of his coat. That would be unwise, Holmes said coolly, unless what you carry is an ecclesiastical commentary. The hand froze. Holmes stepped forward. You are known as Petralchus, a name drawn from a misreading of a 13th century chronicle. A fitting alias for a man who counterfeits history. The stranger's brow flickered. He recovered quickly. You're very informed. I make it my business to be so. I assume you're not with the local police. I find their methods insufficient. Then you're him, the man said. Sherlock Holmes, correct. The man glanced about the room. You're too late. There's nothing left here. Holmes's voice remained calm, but I could hear the edge beneath it. Then you won't object to a search? Petralkas's eyes narrowed. You have no right. I have the truth. And soon the law will follow. Holmes gestured to me and I moved to the corner chest. The same satchel Petralkas carried earlier was already on the floor, half open. I pulled it closer, revealing a slim wooden case tucked inside, precisely the dimensions of a manuscript. Petralkas lunged. Holmes moved faster. In a flash, he caught the man by the collar and shoulder, twisted, and brought him down with astonishing ease. The man hit the flagstone floor with a grunt. Holmes remained crouched over him, one knee pressed to his chest. I advise you to remain still, he said. The struggle ceased. Petralkas lay winded, glaring upward. I opened the case. Inside, wrapped in linen and secured with ribbon, was a manuscript. But not the Curzon. This was something different. The binding was leather, aged, with a broken clasp and a single emblem embossed on the corner. An archaic cross, partially effaced. Holmes leaned over and peered in. The Chronicle of St. Brayon, he murmured. Long thought lost in a fire at Ashwood Priory. Yet here it is. Petralkas's voice was bitter. Recovered, not stolen. I rescued it from a collector, who used it as a display piece. I gave it context, meaning. You gave it false provenance, Holmes said coldly. And had Dr. Northcote discovered that you had doctored the marginalia of this document to pass it off as authentic, you would have lost your most lucrative sale yet. He wasn't supposed to look that closely, but he did. Holmes stood, dusting off his coat. Now you'll tell me what happened to him. Petralkas sat up slowly, wincing. He confronted me. Said he'd go public. Called me a parasite. Said he'd expose every dealer I'd worked with. So I warned him to stay silent. That's all, I swear. Warned him with what? A vial of prussic acid? Or was that simply your idea of a deterrent? The man's face paled. I didn't use it. I just wanted to frighten him. To buy time. Where is he? Holmes asked, voice low. There was a pause. Then, quietly, I left him in the cellar, tied. I was going to come back. Move him. But the house stirred too early. I fled. I felt a tightness in my chest. Holmes turned on his heel without another word, and strode from the apse. I followed, and Petralkas, gritting his teeth, staggered to his feet behind us. We moved quickly across the yard, through the garden path and down to the root cellar. Inside, Holmes seized the lantern from its hook and rushed to the corner where the crates had once been pushed aside. He pulled them away. There, beneath a heap of sacking, was Dr. Ambrose Northcote, pale, unconscious, but alive. Watson. Holmes barked. I was already beside him. I felt for a pulse, faint but steady. His wrists were bruised, his lips dry. There was a residue on the cloth tied near his face. A mild narcotic, perhaps, chloroform or laudanum. A dose meant to keep him quiet rather than kill. We must bring him up, I said. Holmes nodded. Mr. Ellicott must be fetched at once. And the police? He turned to Petralkas, who had remained silent throughout, watching with unreadable eyes. You'll be charged, Holmes said, and more than for theft, kidnapping, attempted murder, fraud, but it is not for me to determine your fate. Petralkas didn't answer. He stared down at the stone floor. Holmes turned back to me. He'll recover, Watson. But this was no amateur's plot. This was a carefully constructed deception, and had the manuscript been sold and the body quietly disposed of, well, we would be reading about it in a footnote, not solving it under torchlight. I nodded. It was the shoes, wasn't it? The dusty ones? Yes, Holmes said, eyes glinting. No one walks through that garden without leaving a trail. And I make it a rule, my dear Watson, always follow the dust. The following morning broke with a clarity rare for an English July, sunlight catching in the dewed hedgerows and casting long golden streaks across the gravel drive of the Northcote residence. Within the house, however, there lingered the breathless hush of recovery, a household roused from the brink of tragedy, yet not fully free from its shadow. Dr. Ambrose Northcote had been moved to his upstairs room, where he lay in bed propped by pillows, his breath shallow but strengthening. A physician from Kettering, summoned promptly by Holmes's telegram in the early hours, had confirmed that, save for dehydration and mild sedation, the scholar would recover in full. It was only a matter of time. Holmes and I had taken breakfast in silence. He stirred his tea with absent precision, his gaze drifting between the window and a small object he had drawn from his coat pocket, the peculiar ring, the seal of Petralchus, which he now examined beneath a pocket lens as if it might yet betray some further secret. The police had taken Petralchus into custody at dawn. Lestrade had not yet arrived, but we expected him by afternoon. Holmes had sent him a telegram so delicately worded it could have been mistaken for a dinner invitation, yet whose implications were unmistakable: forgery, attempted murder, and a European smuggling ring. Arrive with care. "You're thinking again," I remarked, putting down my fork. "I rarely cease." He responded, not unkindly. "But yes, Watson, there is still something incomplete, a question whose answer I have yet to determine." "About the manuscript?" "No, about the man." He stood up and strode once across the room, tapping the edge of the ring on his finger. "Petralchus, or whatever his real name is, did not act entirely alone. That much is apparent. He admitted indirectly that there was a network of forgers. But what concerns me is the timeline." "You mean the day of the disappearance?" "Precisely. Dr. Northcote was apprehended and hidden on Tuesday. We now know that Petralchus departed the apse before sunrise on Wednesday. He intended on returning today, Friday. That leaves a full 48 hours in which he did not contact a buyer or arrange transportation for the book." I frowned. Perhaps he lost nerve. Perhaps, Holmes mused. Perhaps he was waiting for someone. Or something. A light knock interrupted our thoughts. It was George Ellicott, who appeared to have not slept properly despite his best efforts. "He's awake," he stated softly. "He's asked for you both." We followed him upstairs. Dr. Northcote lay on the pillows, his skin pale, but his eyes, those of a scholar accustomed to poring over fine ink and ancient tongues, were sharp and restless. As Holmes approached the bedside, he gave a faint smile. "I never thought I'd owe my life to red chalk and an overgrown root cellar," he said quietly. "You owe it," Holmes remarked quietly, "to your nephew's determination. And to your own refusal to part with the Curzon manuscript." Dr. Northcote grinned and winced slightly. "He offered money first. Then there's a cooperation. When I refused, the tone changed." He repeated me a Latin verse as if it were a bond. "Falsum est quod consentit silentio." What is false becomes truth via quiet. I assured him that silence may be denied. "You mentioned the night Moulton in your notes," Holmes explained. "Why?" "Ah," Northcote replied, his face shining with weary pride. "Because I had started to suspect." Petralchus said the Chronicle of St. Brian was misattributed. He maintained that marginal annotations showed it was duplicated at the Abbey of Ashwood. But I discovered something unexpected in the Curzon manuscript, a reference to Sir Edward Moulton. A lesser night burial at Ashton Leigh. Holmes's brows furrowed together. That name, Northcote concluded, was added after the manuscript's original composition, most likely by the same hand that altered the Chronicle. "Watson, this was a forgery." "A clever one, but not clever enough. Moulton never used the crest depicted in the book. The seal dated from a century later. He'd planned to use your endorsement to sell the Chronicle," Holmes told me. "Yes, I refused him. The next day I was preparing to travel, to denounce the counterfeit to the Society. That's when he arrived." Holmes's face clouded. "He said you had called him a parasite." "I said worse," Northcote answered. "But it wasn't rage that scared me. It was calm. He had arranged everything. The cellar, the drug, the lie. He predicted I'd be gone long enough for the truth to shift." There was silence in the room for a brief moment. Then Holmes turned. "I must return to the church," he replied. "There is one detail left untied, and I don't like loose ends. When we arrived, the church grounds were completely deserted. The apse remained locked and under constable surveillance. Holmes didn't approach it. Instead, he moved along the vestry's outer wall, then followed the crushed grass line back to the ground's rear. "Something Hartley said," he mumbled. "He claimed that the visitor inquired about Sir Edward Moulton's burial. But the ledger, Watson, do you recall the watch's location?" "Ticking. Beside the record book?" "Exactly. Why is it placed this way? To draw attention?" "No. To cover something." We reached the vestry door. It was left open by the local inspector. Inside, dust hung in the slanted light, interrupted only by the faint flutter of a curtain. Holmes went directly to the table and lifted the ledger. A scrap of folded parchment lay beneath it, pushed flat against the wooden surface. He opened it cautiously. It was fragile with age, but the ink was still legible despite being faded. Holmes read it aloud. Sir Edward Moulton, buried beneath the apse, no marker. The iron ring lies behind the faux stone. The entry was sealed at the order of Bishop Averhill in 1754. He looked up at me. That's what Petralchus was after. Not just the chronicle, I responded, breath catching. No, Holmes said. He came to plant the forgery. But he stayed to retrieve something. Something that could have been hidden here since the Reformation. I stared at him. You think Moulton was guarding it? Holmes smiled grimly. I believe Petralchus already knew what the chronicle claimed. The genuine manuscript of the Book of Averhill, a lost volume of ecclesiastical canon law, was hidden beneath Ashton Leigh. The forged document just added weight to the claim. But Moulton's grave held the key, but he didn't find it, Holmes taps the ledger, because Hartley directed him to the incorrect stone. We may never know if this was done on purpose or not. We returned to the apse again, this time escorted by the constable and the local rector. A little iron ring embedded in the stone was found behind the rear altar, partially hidden by rotten floorboards and mildew. With effort, the slab was shifted. Below it was a depression little more than a foot deep, lined with old masonry and soil. 3 securely bound books were preserved within, wrapped in oilcloth. Their covers had no titles, just the sigils of long-forgotten bishops and monasteries. Holmes crouched over them without touching. There's your motive, he replied softly. Forgery disguised a larger steal, and the dust on those July sneakers was the first hint of it all. He rose, wiping off his knees, and stared at me. I think our work here is nearly done, Watson. But what will become of the texts? They will go to the proper hands, Holmes said. Northcote will see to that, and if justice is to be delivered, Petralchus will face more than one courtroom. A charlatan, a manipulator of history, and nearly a murderer. He paused. But in the end, just another man who misjudged the weight of silence. We departed Ashton Leigh that evening, the village slowly exhaling the strain it had inadvertently accumulated. Holmes said little throughout the train ride, and I didn't press him. The sunny evening faded into a cool twilight, and London called us home once more, fog, soot, and everything. But as we traversed the last stretch of countryside before the city, Holmes stared out the window and spoke almost absently. Truth, Watson, he stated, like buried scripture, will outlast the dirt they throw over it. We returned to 221B Baker Street at midnight. London was shrouded in one of its sulky summer fogs, the kind that crawled up from the Thames and slithered over the window panes like a robber. The lamps glowed faintly, as if resentful of their duty, and the only sound we heard from outside was the clop of a late cab on Baker Street's slick cobblestones. Holmes, still dressed in his travel coat, walked straight to the fireplace, lighted a match and set fire to the kindling with mechanical accuracy. Meanwhile, I slid into the other armchair, allowing the room's coziness to settle over me like a warm coat. For a while, Holmes said nothing. He stood with one elbow rested on the mantel and his chin resting on a closed hand, gazing at the young flames. But I'd known him long enough to understand the specific type of quietness that surrounded him now. Not the meditative quiet of closure, but a taut, restless tension that suggested the final piece had not yet found its home. "You're still troubled," I murmured softly. He moved, but his words seemed distant. "There's something in this business that continues to elude me, Watson. Something that does not sit properly. The manuscripts were recovered. Dr. Northcote is safe. Petralchus is in custody. Surely that's all?" Holmes turned, his eyes shining with the sharpness of a man not yet convinced of the solution. "You recall the false seal affixed to the Chronicle of St. Brayon?" "Vividly. A crude forgery by your standards." "Indeed. Nevertheless, the style is very consistent." "Too consistent." I blinked. "I'm not sure I follow." Holmes went to his desk, unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a slim notebook. He flipped through its pages until he came to a sketch that I recognized right away. The cross-like emblem stamped on the corner of the counterfeit document. "This symbol," he explained, "was not created by Petralchus. It appears, with minor modifications, in at least 5 more incidents of ecclesiastical fraud dating back a decade. I saw it once in Vienna, again in Florence, and most recently in a private collection in Bruges, where it was used to authenticate supposed artifacts of early British origin. And each time the relic was shown as a counterfeit. I straightened in my seat. So he's part of a larger operation. Holmes nodded grimly. Yes, even worse, he is not the leader. He closed the notepad and went to the cabinet where his correspondence was housed. He pulled out a wrinkled, wax-sealed letter with no return address. This arrived the morning we left for Ashton Leigh, he explained, handing it to me. I broke the seal and opened the letter. The penmanship was exact, thin, and completely strange. The content, however, sent shivers down my spine. Dear Mr. Holmes, by the time this letter arrives, you will be dealing with the Ashton Leigh situation. Do not be tricked into thinking that the texts are your treasure. They're not. They were intended to distract, drawing your attention to the surface while more valuable ink spilled beneath. Mr. Holmes, what lies beneath the bogus seal is a map. A map you don't yet understand. But they do. They are already moving. A friend of the truth, I looked up slowly. You didn't mention this. I had no evidence of its relation to the case until we discovered the crypt beneath the apse. That message alludes to a pattern rather than Ashton Leigh specifically. Years-long series of falsifications. And now I suspect someone has purposefully drawn me into playing their game. But why? Because, my dear Watson, they want to see if I can keep up. He returned to his seat by the fire and folded his hands. The lamplight caught the sharp line of his cheekbones and the gleam in his eye, which I'd only seen a few times before. Always when the game proved itself to be more deeper than anyone had anticipated. Petralchus was clever, yes, Holmes continued, but he was an instrument. He did not create those documents himself. Instead, he planted them, laundered them, or sent them to collectors who were willing to ask a few simple questions. He had funding, instructions, and protection. What about that ring we found? It was more than just a sign. It was a badge of rank. I furrowed my brow. But then who? That is precisely the question. He rose up again, this time restless. Who runs such a network? Dedicated not only to selling counterfeit relics, but also to rewriting religious and historical records. What is the purpose of placing a fake text beneath a forgotten altar, or adjusting a genealogy in the margins of an old psalter? A buyer's whim? I took a chance, perhaps, he admits, but I believe it is more than trade. There is an agenda behind it, philosophical or political, I am not sure. However, someone is manipulating the past to their own advantage, and that, he added, is considerably more harmful than any mere fraud. I was quiet for a long time. Finally, I asked, what about Hartley? Do you think he was involved? I suspect he knew more than he said, Holmes said, but not enough to understand the entire. He made the error of allowing a stranger to use the apps, and he will pay the consequences. However, his concern was genuine. No man reacts as viscerally to a symbol he does not recognize. Holmes returned to his desk and opened the ledger he had taken from Ashton Leigh, with the rector's permission, to make sense of the burial notes. He pointed to the last page. Here, a rector's marginal remark in 1831 refers to repairs made after the loss of the Averhill copy. Note the phrasing, not robbery or damage, but loss, as if the volume had vanished in plain sight. And it did, I mumbled. Hidden beneath Sir Edward Malton. Exactly, Holmes replied. And now, years later, it is unearthed. Only not by an honest historian, but by a thief acting under orders. He snapped the ledger closed. The map referenced in the letter, he explained quietly, might be allegorical. Or it could be literal. Markings in the Chronicle or the Averhill copy, pointing to other caches, other forgeries planted in locations of historical quiet. In any case, the game is much larger than I had anticipated. And it's not over yet. He turned to me with startling passion. Watson, I'll need you with me in the coming weeks. There will be more of this. Signs and shadows. I suspect Ashton Leigh was just a test. You think whoever sent this letter intends to make contact again? No, Holmes said. I think they already have. He stepped to the window and looked out at Baker Street's gloomy length. Somewhere in this city, he replied, is the next step. And if I don't locate it first, they'll rewrite not only what we know, but what we believe. The fire crackled softly behind us. Outside, a gentle, distant and lonely bell rang the hour. Holmes lingered at the window, his silhouette crisp against the pane, as if seeking the fog for the next clue in an unnamed riddle, and I, observing him from the armchair with a developing shiver despite the warmth. Felt that the case of the man with dusty shoes had only scratched the surface of something far more dangerous, and far from ending. 3 days passed with deceptive quiet. The typical fog coiled in the gutters of Baker Street, hansoms rumbled in the distance, and Mrs. Hudson fussed over meals we rarely touched. But beneath the silence of our quarters, there was a building tension, like the pause before the next move in a great and perilous game. Holmes had said little, but he hadn't been idle. He spent long hours at his desk, reading over ecclesiastical directories, private collectors' registrations, auction house records, and obscure volumes with titles I couldn't pronounce. Names were scrawled and crossed out in his notebook. Seal and marginalia diagrams appeared and vanished on his blotter, like phantom blueprints. On the 4th morning, as I was returning from an errand in Cavendish Square, I discovered Holmes hovering over a recently opened telegram. When I entered, he did not look up and discreetly handed it to me. To Sherlock Holmes from Professor Vernon Laurie, Trinity College, Cambridge, arrived in possession of uncatalogued document through a private agent, sealed with variation of Petralchus emblem. Origin, Caister Priory. I need an urgent opinion. Are you able to come? VLI looked up. Another forgery. Holmes's lips narrowed. Or the next movement in this symphony of shadows. He reaches for his coat. Pack for 2 nights, Watson. We leave on the noon train. Cambridge waits. By early afternoon we were back in the countryside, the verdant fields familiar but still fraught with quiet meaning. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage, abnormally still, but I could tell from the exact flexing of his fingers that his mind was once again racing ahead of the train's movement. I've met Laurie before, he admitted at last. He isn't prone to hyperbole. If he thinks the seal looks like Petralchus, it does. But Laurie is also a man of the old order. Brilliant, yes, but with one particular flaw: he wants to believe. In the authenticity of the piece? Precisely. When you show an academic something long thought to be lost, a charter, a transcript, a codex, wonder takes precedence over caution. This is what these folks prey on. They don't just make artifacts, they also create desire. They make specialists complicit by enticing them with wishes. We arrived in Cambridge under a light afternoon sky and went straight to Trinity College, where Professor Laurie, a tiny stooping man with a balding pate and a constant squint, greeted us in a cluttered study smelling of paper, dust, and faint oranges. He motioned us in, wringing his hands. Holmes. Thank heavens. I feared you'd be gone again. Holmes tilted his head. You mentioned an agent brought you a document? Laurie reached into a lacquered case and took out an old-looking sealed envelope. Arrived by hand. There's no return address. The courier went right away, well-dressed and with an unmistakable accent. Inside this he pulled out a folded sheet, yellowed but supple. The seal had been shattered, but the remains were clearly visible, a design strikingly similar to the one we had seen in Ashton Leigh, though significantly altered. The inner arms of the cross were curled now, like coiled serpents, and the text underneath them had been rendered in a bizarre variation of Latin. Holmes gently lifted it and inspected it beneath the lamp. This is not merely a forgery, he stated. This is a variant. The mark has evolved, suggesting hierarchy or authorship. Whoever issued this intended it to be distinctive. Laurie leaned forward eagerly. But the document itself, look, Holmes, the ink, the calligraphy, the folds, it's unlike any facsimile I've ever seen. The language suggests an account of Henry of Easthall's penance, which no copy has ever survived. If real, it is not real, Holmes stated frankly, but it is designed to appear so. Tell me, Professor, what the agent said when he handed it. Only I had been selected to confirm its significance, that others would shortly get in touch. Holmes's brow darkened. They are sketching a circle, Watson, bringing certain brains into the perimeter. First Northcote, now Laurie. To what end? Not simply to test the forgeries, but to establish legitimacy by names. He turned back to face Laurie. Was this shown to anyone else? No, just you, Holmes exhaled with satisfaction. Then it may still be contained. But not if we remain idle. That evening, at Holmes's recommendation, we took rooms at the Bull Hotel. He stayed silent during dinner, his visage like a slate, until finally, when we went to our room, he remarked, "They're planning something bigger." This was not an attempt to sell a relic. This was a probe, a signal. They wanted to see how you would respond. And when? I? Or somebody like you, trusted, scholarly, and discreet. They'll relocate again, and they'll try to pass something else, something hazardous. He sat down at the writing desk and drew a blank sheet. We need to get ahead of them, Watson. We must anticipate their next offer. That means locating the source, not the courier, not Petralcus, but the architect. And how do we do that? Holmes offered me a weak smile. We bait the scholar's trap. He dipped his pen and wrote one sentence, slowly and methodically, to whom it may concern. The seal is known. The code is broken. Should we discuss in terms of trade? He folded the note and sealed it with wax. This will be copied and quietly transmitted through a chain of intermediaries, bookshops, private collectors, several willing antiquarians. They'll know it's from me, and if they are the people I suspect, they will answer. He sat back. And now we wait. The next day passed in relative silence. Holmes did not leave the room except for brief walks around the quadrangle. I stayed nearby, reviewing the Ashton Leigh notes and looking at maps of old religious centres like Lincoln, York and Canterbury, wondering if the next seed had already been planted in one of them. It was nearly dusk when the hotel porter delivered an unmarked envelope to our room. Holmes accepted it without comment, opened it and read the one line inside. Saturday, 11 p.m., the cloisters of Ely. Bring no one who asks questions. He folded the page and gazed at me. Well, Watson, he remarked softly, we've made contact. I frowned. Ely is a long journey. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Not if the truth lies beneath it. He rose and sought for his coat. They intend to meet in a spot they consider sacred. They have forgotten that the sacred cannot be forged. We would travel to Ely. We'd venture into the shadows of ancient stone, where monks once trod and mysteries now move. And there, beneath the cloisters, Holmes intended to confront the next link in the chain, and once again, I'd follow. The wind that blew across the marshes of Cambridgeshire was harsh and moist, curling beneath our collars as we stepped off the late evening train in Ely. The cathedral loomed beyond the station like a relic too great to be forgotten, its lantern tower bathed in silver moonlight, and its spires piercing the night with silent determination. Even in the stillness, the massive structure exuded a presence that went beyond architecture. It appeared to breathe. Holmes said nothing on the carriage ride into town. His gaze never left the cathedral. His gloved and steady right hand rested on the lapel of his coat, which now held the sealed message. I examined him intently, noting that his features lacked the customary theatrical detachment. He was coiled, focused, but unusually solemn, as if his mind, restless and quick as it was, recognized the danger that lay ahead. We arrived at the south transept shortly before 11 o'clock. The great nave was closed to the public, but a side door had been left unlocked. Whether by invitation or oversight, I did not know. Holmes led the way through the cloisters with no hesitation. They were ancient, honed by centuries of tread and prayer. The moonlight filtered through the high arches, pooling on the stone like shallow water. We came to the eastern cloister walk and paused. A figure stood beneath a broken arch, with ivy clinging to the mortar. Cloaked, motionless and alone. Holmes raised a hand but said nothing. We approached slowly, our footsteps echoing like dropped pins. The figure turned as we came within a dozen paces. A woman, tall, dressed in a long grey travelling coat and gloves, her face obscured by the hood that cast shadow over her features. You came, she said, her voice calm but firm. He said you would. Holmes tilted his head. And who is he? A man who does not enjoy attention, but he watches and he listens. And he knows when someone is watching back. Holmes took a step closer. You're the one who sent the letter to Baker Street. She said nothing. Holmes's tone did not shift, and the message to Cambridge, you were the courier. A pause. Then softly, I am the hand, but not the eye. Then speak with your own. The woman reached into her coat and withdrew a sealed envelope. She extended it to Holmes without approaching further. You were meant to find Ashton Leigh, she said. That was deliberate. Petralcus was compromised. He grew careless. He deviated from instruction and attempted profit. He failed. You did not. Holmes took the envelope, turning it once in his fingers. What does your employer want? To offer you something. What? She paused. Then, the truth. But only in pieces. I stepped forward. Why this theatre? Why not name yourselves? Her eyes, when they lifted beneath the hood, were intelligent but guarded. Because what we offer is not understood when given in full. It must be absorbed slowly, like medicine or poison. Holmes opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, handwritten in the same precise script as the earlier note. The next forgery is already in place. York, Cathedral Archives. Room of St. Olaf, look beneath the altar stone. There lies the second clue. You have 3 days before the record is amended permanently. Use them, Holmes looked up. Why send this to me? Because you can be trusted to see what others miss. But more than that, you can be trusted to act without falling in love with what you uncover. The truth, Mr. Holmes, is often a terrible burden. You speak like a convert. She allowed herself a small, bitter smile. No, a former librarian. Holmes's gaze narrowed. Then you know what they're rewriting. I know what they think they're rewriting. The past. But they're wrong. They're building a new belief. And when enough people believe, the forgery becomes fact. Holmes folded the page and slipped it into his coat. Will I see you again? No, she said. You're getting too close. And without waiting for response, she turned and disappeared into the opposite cloister, her footfalls fading into the night like the last notes of a hymn. We did not pursue her. Holmes stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned to me. 3 days. York is half a day's journey, I said. Then we leave at first light. We return to our lodgings in silence. Holmes did not sleep, nor did he rest. I heard him pacing in the next room until dawn, the soft rhythm of his steps like a ticking clock, winding down toward something inevitable. The following day, we boarded the early train to York. The city greeted us with a grim drizzle, but Holmes seemed impervious to discomfort. He led us directly to the cathedral without pause for food or rest. There, at the administrative wing beside the chapter house, we requested access to the archives under the pretext of scholarly consultation. We were let into the room of St. Olaf, late in the afternoon, which was an austere chamber lined with cabinets and stacks of iron-bound ledgers. At its center stood a low sandstone altar, unremarkable but clean, with an iron cross set into the stone. Holmes slowly walked around it. He then knelt and pressed his hands against the base. There, he whispered quietly. Her seam. We worked together to lift the stone panel, revealing a tiny hollow. A thin stack of papers lay inside, wrapped in oilcloth. Holmes withdrew them and placed them on the adjacent desk. He quickly flipped through the pages, his expression sharpening with each turn. Then he paused and lifted one up to the light. It was a registry, consisting of ordinations and appointments dating back to 1451. However, there had been an addition to the top margin. Faint, recent, yet handled with the same care that we had seen before. Robertus de Moreham, Primus Archivarius, custodian of the true canon. Beneath it, a mark, not Petrarchus's sigil. A new one, a serpent devours its own tail. Holmes stared at it. They're leaving a trail, I mumbled. Breadcrumbs? No, he said slowly. They're leaving signs for others to follow. This is a recruitment. Into what? Holmes looked up at me. Into a conspiracy to change history. Not via bloodshed or battle, but with writing. Through misremembering. They aren't just forging relics, Watson. They're forging belief. He folded the sheet and placed it back in the cloth. Seal it. We bring this back to London. But we tell no one else. Not yet. As we replaced the stone, Holmes halted with one hand on the altar. When the past can be altered with such elegance, he continued, what becomes of truth? I had no answer. And outside, the bells of York Minster rung the hour, not as heralds, but as warnings. By the time we got back to London, the air was heavy with summer haze, and Baker Street's characteristic fog had been replaced by an oppressive silence. Holmes sat next me in the cab, silent and immobile, the oilcloth bundle from York tucked safely behind his arm. Though the street was bustling with carriages and footsteps, Holmes did not even look out the window. His attention was concentrated inside, on a realm of thinking that I could only speculate about. When we arrived, he went directly to his desk without taking off his coat. He carefully unwrapped the documents and spread them out, weighing each corner with a familiar object. The brass magnifier, the Moroccan paperweight, and the old clay pipe. Then he opened his notepad and worked for several hours with such focused attention that I was unable to talk for fear of breaking the spell. He pushed back from the desk just after midnight. The tip of his pen stuck in mid-word. "They've named themselves," he added. I looked up from my seat by the fireplace. "Who?" Holmes tapped the margin of the document that we had found beneath the altar in York. This entry: Robertus de Morham, custodian of the true canon. The phrase is deliberate. Not just a bogus appointment, but a signal. De Morham has never existed, but the title is their invention. And this, he pointed to the looping sigil of the serpent devouring its tail, is not just symbolic, it's organizational. The sign of the Ordo Ouroboros. The Order of the Serpent? I said. Ouroboros, he reiterated. A symbol as ancient as believing itself. Mystics, alchemists, and theologians have all used this term to describe cycles of truth and distortion. It's the perfect metaphor for their goal, which is to recreate the past in their own image, to create history not merely for wealth or status, but also to guide future convictions. They believe that by altering sacred documents, they can shift the axis of cultural memory. And York was only the second. Holmes nodded. This is our second discovery, but I believe there are more. And the next might not wait for us to arrive. He rose and approached the window. The city spread before him in silhouette, its rooftops unclear in the dim starlight. They wanted me to see this, he explained softly. Every breadcrumb, every whisper was a lure. Not to discourage me, but to invite me. Invite you? Yes, to participate, or to bear witness, or even to join. He turned back and his demeanor was colder than I'd seen in weeks. But that's not their mistake. Their mistake is believing that I can't read their endgame. He marched to the cabinet and took out a slim folio of paper, reading through it until he found a letter written in deep green ink. He held it out for me. This, he explained, was given to a private collector in Amsterdam only 6 weeks ago. The contents, a fragment of the Council of Nicaea purportedly retrieved from a Syrian monastery, destroyed during Napoleon's battles. The ink, language, and seals are frighteningly similar. The same hand, Holmes nodded, or one taught by the same. The most disturbing feature was that it arrived with a letter of authentication written by an anonymous entity and containing simply the Ouroboros sigil. The collector was skeptical and had it checked by a document specialist. The parchment was 600 years old. The ink, however, was less than 5. They're aging documents artificially. Yes, but this is not new. What is new is the cooperation, the timing. These are not random frauds. They're arranged with purpose, into academic circles, private archives, and even church vaults. They are slowly, almost unconsciously, rewriting history. He sank into the chair, steepling his fingers. And I have reason to believe the next forgery will not be a document. I stared at him. What do you mean? I mean they're migrating to relics, physical artifacts, bones, robes, and altar stones, elements that elicit visceral faith. Things that once declared authentic are difficult to deny. I felt a cold. Do you know where? Perhaps. He reached into the folio and took out a second page. One of my contacts in Rome intercepted this letter. A shipment is due to arrive at the Basilica of St. Benedict in Fulda, Germany. The manifest only includes one item, Arca Martyrum, the chest of the martyrs. Holmes nodded. A relic long thought lost in the wars of succession. But it's more than just a reliquary. Early stories said that it contained the femur of St. Tiberius, an obscure saint consecrated solely through oral tradition. If it were to be recovered and authenticated, it may serve as the foundation for a complete religious story. I understood right away. And if that narrative is false, if it's built on forgery, then every doctrine it supports would be tainted. Precisely. Holmes stood. We're leaving tomorrow for Fulda. We must intercept the artifact before it is consecrated. Once it is installed in a cathedral, the truth is no longer a matter of ink or bone, but of belief. And belief, Watson, is the one thing they rely on to withstand criticism. That night I slept a bit. I lay awake, listening to Holmes walk around in the opposite room, the rustle of papers punctuated by the odd stroke of his pen. By morning he was prepared, composed, deliberate, and already plotting our itinerary as we departed for the station. As the train rumbled across France and into Germany, Holmes informed me more. His contact in Fulda was a monk named Brother Anselm, who had grown suspicious about the unusual influx of money associated with a planned exhibit of early Christian relics. A week before, He had contacted Holmes using an encoded route developed during a previous inquiry into fake Templar seals. The date of Anselm's warning was too close to the intercepted letter to disregard. We arrived in Fulda 2 days later, under the pale shadow of a looming thunderstorm. The village was calm and cobblestoned, evoking the unhurried grandeur of antiquity. The church rose above it, its red sandstone walls and domes silhouetted against the cloudy sky. Brother Anselm greeted us at a side entrance, his robes soaked from rain and his eyes sunken with worry. He led us down narrow hallways to a special archive beneath the sacristy. There, he continued, pointing to a huge wooden crate sealed in wax. It came yesterday morning. The abbot believes it is a sign, her miracle. Holmes went to the crate and studied the seal. It's not official, but precisely groomed to resemble one. Has anyone opened it? No, Anselm replied. They're waiting for the bishop. Holmes knelt, pulled a little blade from his coat and shattered the wax. He lifted the lid. Inside, a linen-wrapped package was nestled in straw. Holmes slowly unwrapped it, layer by layer, revealing the object within, a dark and polished wooden chest used to house sacred relics. He opened it. A lone human bone rested on a red velvet pillow, a femur. Next to it is a folded vellum document. Holmes lifted it, read it, and gave it to me. The writing was elaborate, Latin, but the seal at the bottom is the Ouroboros. Holmes exhaled. They have begun. This is the first of many. What now? We stop the consecration. We uncover the swindle. And then we'll follow the trail. He stood, his expression unreadable. They believe that history may be altered without resistance. Let us prove them wrong. Outside, thunder rumbled across the sky. The thunderstorm has arrived. The storm raged over Fulda, rattling the cathedral's stained glass windows and sending bleak slanted waves of rain across the cloister. Thunder reverberated through the vaulted stone halls, like the voice of a faraway tribunal, stern and vigilant. Beneath it all, in the cloistered silence of the archive chamber, Holmes remained motionless before the open reliquary, his expression inscrutable, but for the tautness around his jaw. Brother Anselm silently crossed himself, his gaze riveted on the bone snuggled in velvet. They intend to present it during Sunday Mass, he added, voice subdued despite the thunder. A public unveiling. The bishop has already prepared a homily. Holmes reached down to pick up the accompanying vellum once more. This document is the linchpin, he said quietly. Without it, the relic is only a curiosity. With it, they confer lineage, authority, and divinity. I moved closer. Can it be disproved? Holmes's mouth curled slightly. It is incredibly brilliant. The ink is old, but not nearly as old as the text suggests. The language resembles ecclesiastical Latin from the 9th century, but tiny errors show its recent origin. A scholarship-based construction, rather than one for practical use. Whoever wrote this knew just enough to fool the devoted, while alarming the discerning. He slowly closed the reliquary lid, as if to seal away more than just bone. They are escalating. Manuscripts were first, followed by burial records, and are now hallowed objects. Each fake is more bold than the last. Brother Anselm peered between us. Will you confront the bishop? Holmes shakes his head. Not yet. Not until we know who delivered it and how far the rot has spread. We returned with Anselm along a small path to a disused vestry, where he showed us the delivery manifest. Holmes drew a quick gasp after briefly studying it. Here, the box was registered under a name I'd seen before, Marienfeld Antiquities, Antwerp. That's Petralcus's old channel, I said, recognizing it right away. Holmes nodded grimly. But the courier's signature is new, A. Brangwyn, not a recognized associate, likely a placeholder, an alias to conceal the true hand. Anselm hesitated before approaching a cabinet and withdrawing a narrow black leather case. This was left with the bishop's copy of the document, he informed me. He believed it was a gift from the same donor. The case was opened by Holmes. Inside was a heavy dark ring that was unmistakable. Another Ouroboros, but this one differed slightly from the others. The serpent's eye was set with a little red garnet. Holmes's voice sounded flat. A marker. Likely denoting rank, he turned to face me. Watson, if they distribute them together with the artifacts, they are branding participants as well as objects. We must suppose that the bishop is a pawn or a player. Do we question him? Holmes paused, then shook his head. Not directly. We need confirmation. Something irrefutable. We start from the beginning. The crate originated from Antwerp. The forwarding office is listed here, Rue des Minimes. We will travel tonight, I blinked. But the storm is precisely why we'll go unnoticed. With Anselm's reluctant approval, we departed Fulda after nightfall, bundled against the elements and carrying only what we could conceal. Holmes kept the vellum and ring in a sealed envelope tucked inside his coat. So I took the delivery log. When we arrived in Antwerp, it was still early morning. The rain-soaked metropolis sparkled like a shell under the lamplight. Holmes didn't waste any time. We went straight to Rue des Minimes and found the forwarding office in a quiet quarter near the old merchant wharves, a low building of soot-darkened stone with a rusted bell and a door that only opened after Holmes produced an old business card. Bearing the crest of a London antiquarian house, long since shuttered but still respected by reputation, the clerk was elderly and reserved, but Holmes possessed a talent for languages and bribery alike. He quickly learnt what he required. The cargo headed for Fulda did not pass through customs but arrived in a private shipment labelled devotional statuary. It originated in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city's port sector, which was leased to Calum Maritime Holdings. Holmes' eyes sharpened at once. "I know that name," he said. It was designated as a shell organization in a land dispute over a Benedictine site in Sardinia, where fraudulent maps were discovered, indicating that the Vatican had previously claimed the area. However, the maps disappeared before the trial. The same pattern. We arrived at the docks in a hired cab, just as the morning broke in drab. Bruised clouds over the North Sea. The warehouse was enormous and anonymous, with simply a black-painted entrance and a faded coat of arms above it, once noble but now peeling and unintelligible. Holmes picked the lock with clinical efficiency. We snuck in. The room was vast, crammed with containers of all sizes. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by our breathing and footsteps. However, it wasn't until we got to the far wall that we realized the reality. Rows of relics. Some were wrapped in fabric, while others were in half-opened cases. Chalices, rosaries, bones, and parchments. Each is carefully tagged in Latin. Each bears the Ouroboros mark. Holmes remained immobile before them. "This," he added softly, "is not forgery. It's manufacturing. Her factory of beliefs." He came forward and examined the tags. "Here's one heading for Prague. Another for Lyon, and here, look, Watson, London. St. Etheldrada's." I felt something stiffen in my chest. "They've already infiltrated Britain." He nodded. "They're sowing the continent quietly, purposefully. And if we don't stop them soon, their fictions will become facts. And their relics will be cherished." We turned when we heard a door open in the distance, voices. At least two were headed toward the main floor. Holmes gestured discreetly, and we hid behind a stack of shipping pallets, squatting. Two men entered. One is tall and thin, while the other is broad and hooded. They spoke German, but Holmes translated under his breath. "They are discussing the next shipment. One leaves for Rome in 3 days. It houses a relic of St. Adrian the Veiled, a name that does not exist." The tall one claims the order was expedited. The hooded one agrees, but claims that the London problem has caused funds to be delayed. "They will contact V to intervene." I murmured, "V for—" Holmes's eyes glittered. "Possibly Vernon Laurie, or someone above him." We waited until the men had passed before slipping out the side entrance into the downpour. Holmes did not respond until we were halfway back to the motel. They are well-funded, well-placed, but not omniscient. They miscalculated Fulda. And now we have a lead. What do we do with it? We notify the Vatican discreetly. We bring in the Archbishop of Canterbury's office. We begin to disrupt the system through exposure rather than arrests. As we entered the foyer, he turned to face me. But more crucially, we catalogue everything. Each item. Every falsehood. Because one day, Watson, someone will try to recount this narrative in a different way. And when they do, they'll find a record that cannot be erased. That evening, Holmes began transcription. I joined him and we wrote together, not just as detectives, but as historians at odds with silence. Because truth once buried must be exhumed carefully and with honor. A few weeks later, as September's first frost swept the summer haze from London's streets, Holmes and I sat once more in our Baker Street quarters, the fire blazing and a stack of final correspondence on the table between us. Outside, the plane tree's leaves rustled crisply in the evening breeze, and Mrs. Hudson's radio could be dimly heard downstairs, playing a lullaby of string and brass. But Holmes was not at peace. Though the immediate threat had passed and the Fulda outfit had been dissolved, his mind remained preoccupied with the case's lingering issues. Across the room, he clutched a letter from Rome, its contents brief but clear. The Vatican Secretariat confirmed the discovery of the Antwerp warehouse, and the catalogued relics were seized and transported under ecclesiastical supervision. Several bishops, including a dubious choice from Venice, had quietly resigned. Vernon Laurie, the Cambridge professor who had received the falsified document, had vanished from public view, with his lectures cancelled, his lodgings empty, and only a single page in his study with the words, "The canon bends toward creation." Holmes set the letter aside. "They've gone to the ground, Watson. Not vanquished, just scattered, like ash in the breeze. But they have been seen now, named, and that is anathema to them. You believe they'll try again?" "In time," he replied, "but not soon. Their strength lay in stillness, in probing beneath the surface of history. That skin is torn now. Their seclusion has become a show." I nodded slowly. "The Church has declared an embargo on fresh relic certifications. The British Museum Council has initiated an internal study of ecclesiastical objects acquired since 1890. Even Trinity College has started re-examining provenance assertions. You haven't just stopped them. You've piqued their interest. That," Holmes said quietly, "is the only antidote to forgery, curiosity, not indignation, not belief. But there is a desire to look again." He turned to the desk and opened his notebook, which was now thin and practically full. The last entry, written in his exact mechanical style, was straightforward. The Order of the Ouroboros planned to recreate history by burying new truths alongside old ones. But what they didn't realize was that memory, like ink, leaves traces. You can't rewrite the past without first dealing with its ghost. He closed the book. A knock on the door. Mrs. Hudson walked in carrying the Evening Post and a tray of tea. Among the envelopes, one was addressed to me rather than Holmes. I opened it slowly. The inside contained a single piece of paper, a lovely charcoal drawing of an Ouroboros that has been shattered in two. A Latin line beneath it reads, "Veritas est fractura nostra." Truth is our fracture. Holmes took a cursory look at it and smiled. "They have heard us, Watson, and they are rattled, but not finished." "No," he replied, "not finished. But neither are we." We drank tea in solitude, and as the fire crackled in the hearth and London sank into its dusk hum, I thought of dusty shoes, forged histories, Ely cloisters, and Fulda's reliquary. I remembered the patient hands that had penned falsehoods so lovely that they could nearly be mistaken for faith. And I remembered Holmes, unyielding, unblinking, pulling truth to light, not with sermon or sword, but with ink, reasoning, and perseverance. The world would forget. It always has. But Sherlock Holmes never did. And as long as he remembered, the forgers of history would never be at ease.